And I have been working in museums in Japan and in the United States for over 25 years now, mostly in Japanese art. And right now I am a senior specialist at the Kyoto National Museum. And I want to say thank you to Toshikatsu and to Tim for inviting me today, and thank you for all of you for coming out on this rainy evening here in Kyoto, and also for the people who are joining us online. Toshikatsu asked us to give a talk today about Japanese culture from a foreigner's perspective. I see in the audience that we have a number of people who are, experienced, Japan residents, long-term, and both Tim and I have had experience of, many decades living, being back and forth between Japan and the West, so it's rather difficult. It's rather a tall order to ask us to talk about Japan from a foreign perspective at this point, because over time I feel like I've kind of lost my beginner's eye and my sort of beginner's mind in the way, the kind of perception of Japan that I had in the beginning. I personally first came to Japan when I was an elementary school student and was here for 6 months, and then I came back a little bit for homestay in high school. But my first long-term visit to Japan was when I was a university student, and I came to Japan for my junior year, my third year of college, of university. And I came to Kyoto for 1 year. And it's that year, or actually, I guess I could say from that time, living in Japan, I worked to sort of acclimate myself to the culture as much as possible. And so the kinds of things that used to bother me, or the things that I would notice or would surprise me don't really surprise me anymore. Japan, it feels like part of me, and Japanese culture is, it's like part of my life. So I may not be the right person to ask, but Toshikatsu asked us to talk for 15 minutes today. So I thought I'd just think back to when I was younger, and the kinds of keywords, or the kinds of impressions I had when I was younger, and just tell you about that, what was the kinds of things that were especially notable to me at that point. And there were various keywords that I thought of when I was thinking of the kinds of things that have stuck with me over the decades in Japan. I could have talked about like consideration for others, thinking about other people, like diligence, like working really hard at things, like skills, personal like training, and personal sort of raising yourself up personally. But the keyword I decided to talk about is adaptation, kind of like tekisetsu, or like adapting yourself to a situation. And the example I want to talk about is when I first came to Japan as a college student. I was asked for my housing situation, where I wanted to live. Did I want to live in a homestay? Did I want to live in an apartment? Or did I want to live in a Zen temple? And at that point, I was really interested in having as many kind of new personal experiences as I could. And so I decided to do the temple. And I didn't know what I was getting into. I'd never really studied Buddhism before. I'd studied Japanese history, but I didn't know what I was getting into. But it turned out that this decision to live in a temple when I was, 20 or 21 has really influenced my whole life, I think. And it's probably the main reason that I still, am living, choosing to live in Japan or choosing to live the lifestyle I have, and have remained, in Japanese studies all these years. The temple I lived in was called the Nagaoka Zenjuku, and it's a place in Nagaoka Kyoshi. It's south of Kyoto, and it was built in the, I think, 1930s, before the war. And it was built so that it was built by a disciple of Nishida Kitaro, the famous Kyoto University professor and philosopher of the Kyoto School. And that disciple, the student, was named Morimoto Shonen, who became a Zen Roshi, a Zen master. And he was sponsored by corporate sponsors to create a facility where university students could live and study Zen while they were still going to school. So you have a very rigid, kind of strict lifestyle at home, and then during the day you can go to your classes. And that's continued on since that time. When I was there, the Roshi had the student, the disciple of Morimoto Shonen, whose name was Asahi Gisen Roshi, and he was living there. He was the Zen master. There was also a nun who lived there as well, who'd trained under Morimoto Shonen. And then there were also two unsui, two monks in training, who had been to Daitokuji Monastery and studied, and now they were doing higher level koan training with the Roshi and living there, and also overseeing the students who lived there. And we students lived within the Zenjuku in individual rooms, maybe about, I think they're like 3 tatami mats, maybe, sanjo rooms. And it's on a long hallway with little rooms on the side. And then there was a whole other area with long hallways around it, around a central garden. And the Roshi lived at the far end of one area. And then separate from that, there was also a large zendo, where a Zen meditation hall. So every morning while we were there, we would wake up at 5:30 or 6, depending on the season. And, we would put on our kimono and hakama and go into the zendo. And we would have the morning service every morning. So we would chant sutras, and the head student or the monk would lead in the sutra chanting. And then after that was finished, we would all run to line up for sanzen, which is a special audience with the Roshi. And then we, one by one, we would walk down a very long hall, I can't remember if we go like with our hands praise, and we meet one by one in front of the Zen master and give the answer to a koan that we've received. After that, we all finish. Then we go back to our rooms. We take off the hakama, put cords around our taski, right, around our kimono, to hike up the skirts of our kimono and put around our sleeves. And then we start doing the interior cleaning. And that is another maybe half an hour or so. We get lots of buckets of water. We have cleaning above. We have to swab all the floors. So when you swab the floors, and these are very long hallways in a Zen temple, as many of you know, you have a towel, you wring it out, you put it down on the floor, you go down on all fours and you run down the hall. And then when you get to the other end, you turn around and you put the towel on the other half of the hallway, and then you run all the way back. And there are many, many long hallways in there. So that all of that had to be done before breakfast. And then after that, everyone goes to breakfast. At the beginning of eating at breakfast, you first you have rice porridge every morning, and you take a little, and umeboshi, dried plums, salted plums, and you take a little bit of rice and you put it on your table. And as you're chanting the morning sutra, somebody takes the little bit of rice, and that's for the hungry ghosts, the gaki, who are creatures living in one of the Buddhist hells. That is taken away. Then after that, after breakfast, we put on our work clothes, and then we go outside. And the area, the whole Zenjuku is about Nisen Tsubo, 2,000. It's quite large. It's maybe 1.6, 1.7 acres, quite a large area. And that whole has to be morning and all the area around it. All of that sweeping has to be done, and then finally at about 8 or 8:30 it's done, and people can go to university and get ready to go to school. So that was every morning before school even started, and there's no heating, there's no air conditioning, so you're entirely outdoors. And there's hardly any talking, almost no talking. So as you're doing it, you're thinking a lot about what's happening. And it's a lot of hard work, and the value is on keeping everything clean and well kept. I was raised by a father who had spent time in the military, in the Navy. And so I was taught when I was younger, when you do something, you must do it right. So like when you make a bed, you have to do a proper square corner. And in the military, they bounce a nickel off the bed, and if it bounces, then it's clean, it's made well. But if it's not, if it's not done, then they tear it out and you have to do it again. So it's very black and white. Like they make the bed, it's done well or it's not done well. So I thought, okay, in the temple, probably the same kind of value system of it's done well or it's not done well will apply. I thought it's like the gardens are clean or they're not clean. If you've done a good job or you've done a bad job. And that's what I, as an American coming in, I brought to that. And in the beginning, careful about getting all the leaves out under the bushes and every corner clean, and doing a good job. But I remember my surprise day when the head monk would yell at me, get angry at me for doing too much, because I was not keeping up with the group. And that's just one example, but being there, and this is something that I've seen over and over again, is that it's not there is one way to do it and another, this is right and this is wrong. The key in that situation was that I needed to read the room, as they say in Japan. In English, you say read the room. In Japanese, you might say kuki o yomu, read the air or something. But you need to look at the situation and adapt yourself to the situation. So what is correct in one situation, the next day it might be wrong, it might be incorrect. Every day is different. And that's something I think that's true in Buddhist philosophy as well, of everything is changing, always changing, and nothing is the same. And very much the training of a Zen monk and in a temple is learning to fit yourself into any situation that arises in an appropriate way, and adapting yourself to the situation. And I can also say that I think this follows through in Japanese society in general. I work now in a museum, and the way that this is not the only reason, but the way that the administrative division of the museum is, the somuka, the administration. All the administrators who work in our museum work in their one specialized area for only 3 years at the most. So if you are a administrative worker in a museum, you might be in the HR, the jinjika, the human relations division for 3 years, and then the next year you put into the finance division, for you're doing payroll or something in the finance division. That doesn't make any sense from a specialization perspective. You would want normally somebody to become very good at HR and to stay in HR and become a specialist. In the West, in the museum I worked at, you have specialists in every division and they stay in their same divisions. But in Japan, they want people maybe not to be the best, but they want people to be adaptable. They want people to not become entrenched in one way of doing things and to be able to change. And so I think that word adaptability is a key word for really understanding a lot of aspects of Japanese culture. And that's my 15 minutes or more.
Do I go in? That was great. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if we're supposed to compliment each other or that's, but I don't think what I will be able to say will be anything like as interesting as what Melissa just did. But I'll follow Melissa and just give you a very quick jikoshokai, although some things are written on the back about both of us. But I came to Japan at the age of 19, and I remember very well the summer. I can't remember the date, but I remember Prince Charles and Lady Diana got married that summer, so probably most of you in the room weren't even born then. And I often say to Japanese friends, they say, "Oh, Japanese is so good, congratulations." And I say, well, actually, I've been learning Japanese for longer than you have if I meet somebody who's under the age who wasn't born at that time. So think in those terms, my Japanese remains very bad. But anyway, I came to Japan between school and university. I thought I wanted to do Japanese studies, but I'd never been here. And my parents thought, you better go and see what this country is before you go. And but my interest in Japan didn't come from nowhere. There were many reasons for it, but one quite influential one was that my father also had been in the army, not the Navy, but in the Second World War. He had trained in Japanese. And his training was very intensive because you may know from your history that all the British speakers of Japanese were all captured at Singapore by the Japanese army. And of course, the defeat came very soon after that, but people didn't know. So the British Army rapidly needed people that would speak, well, not speak, but could decode Japanese messages. And my father was one of the people selected to do this. And he always tells the story, but a lot of my father's stories weren't true, but he always told the story that this kind of recruiting person went around to various universities, language departments, to see who'd be good at learning Japanese. And you were given a kind of a line, and then you had to work through a puzzle to get an answer. But the person had been giving the same test to people so long, he accidentally, when it came to my father, he said, "This is the first line, and you've got to work out how it comes to mean this." And he accidentally told the answer. And so my father said he sat there for 2 or 3 minutes pretending to think, and then said the answer. And the person said, "Nobody's ever done it so quickly before." And so he was drafted in and sent to learn Japanese. And by the time that training was finished and by the time they got to Japan, the war was over. So fortunately, my father never saw danger, and he came to Japan and many people in Japan think it was an American occupation. And as you'd expect, America took all the important parts, but they gave many of the regional parts to Britain. So everything basically west of Kobe was British. And of course, that importantly included Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which the USA did not want to occupy. So that was in the British area. And then my father was a very junior person, but his commanding officer was discovered to had entered into a black market organization with the Japanese head of police. This is completely illegal, right? And so my father's regiment, they were very concerned the Americans would find out. And so the regiment was disbanded, and my father was sent to Tottori. And he spent 3 years in Tottori with absolutely nothing to do. And he loved it, right? He loved it. And so he came home from Japan with many, many stories about how wonderful Japan was. And he always said, although he'd seen Japan at one of the most awful moments in its history, that Japan is going to be somewhere to look out for in the future. And so when I was wondering what to do at university, and I liked languages, but doing French and German seemed really boring, and he said, do Japanese. So I always liked the fact that my father had seen Japan at a very specific moment, and I was seeing Japan also at a very specific moment when I came here, but the moment in which you live often seems to you the norm, right? And it's only in subsequent times they look back and say, that was a very strange moment. The Second World War, of course, was a very strange moment. But I came here in the bubble years, and that was also a very strange moment. Anyway, that was my little story, but I moved to Japan 5 years ago and moved to Kyoto 3 years ago. So, and between studying Japanese and 5 years ago, I was at the University of London, where I taught Japanese history and art history. So the actual topic that we're here to talk about, as Melissa already said, we're not fresh off the boat. Our ideas of Japan and the other of you who are living who are in the room, who are not born in this country, we're not at all, our opinions are already formed. But one thing which I think is eternally interesting to me is why on earth Japanese people care about foreigners' opinions of them. You know, I mean, I could not imagine an event like this in Britain, or probably not in the USA, where we'd get a bunch of foreigners to tell us what they think about us, because we don't care, right? Well, we do care, but I mean, it's not part of our self-definition to care. And this reminds me of a joke I was told about, where an American, a French, you can go on for a long time anyway, an American, a French, a German, and a British, I'll limit to 4 people, American, French, German, and British, they all traveling together, and they go into the jungle, and they all see an elephant for the first time. They'd never seen an elephant. And so they're very excited, and when they go home, they decide each one's going to write a book about elephants. And so the American writes a book called Elephants, The Secret of Their Success and How We Can Learn From Them. The British person writes a book called Elephants and the Class System. The French person writes a book called L'amour chez les éléphants. And the Japanese one writes a book called Zo Karamita Nihon. And it's kind of funny, it's kind of true, right? That I'm sure whichever countries you're from or you know about, add your country into this, it can be quite amusing. And just so why Japanese are interested in what people think about from the outside is an intriguing question in itself. And I suspect it may be partly linked to the fact that Japan is very near to unique in the world in not having been colonized. Almost everywhere in the world either was literally colonized in a destructive way, such as virtually all of Africa or the Philippines or Myanmar, for example, or India, or was pretty close to it, such as Taiwan, Thailand and large parts of China. But Japan didn't have that. And so Japan was able to modernize on its own terms. And Japan's a country pretty unique, although I couldn't possibly say whether it's absolutely unique or not, that for which modernization did not mean the same thing as westernization. And it didn't mean the same thing as listening to what the people who've taken over your country and are now governing it tell you should be doing. And so Japan's path towards modernity is a very unusual one. And sometimes those of us who are foreign think, like, why the hell do the Japanese do that? Why can I go to Thailand? I don't even speak the language. I know what's happening. I can go to Myanmar. I don't speak the language. I know what's happening. I come to Japan. I speak the language. I don't know what's happening, because things weren't forced into a Western way of doing things here. And of course, that's a huge escape for Japan, a wonderful thing. And it's why all foreigners come to Japan feel that ancient traditions survive so amazingly well here, even with modernization, because modernity and westernization in Japan didn't mean the same thing, and it's a very special case. So when Japan opened to the West, think about it, 1868, and I studied the Edo period. So in the Edo period, there's a lot of discussion. Is Japan even really one country in the Edo period? Japan is a kind of renpo, right? Kind of federal state in the Edo period. People are often surprised when you say the shogun only controlled about 20% of Japan's land mass. Westerners think a shogun is like Julius Caesar or Napoleon, right? But the shoguns, of course, they had the acknowledged control of the daimyo, but they could hardly enforce it in most cases. And so in Edo, and probably also earlier periods I don't know much about, Japan is like a cluster of different countries. And of course, being a cluster of different countries, it's always falling apart. Civil wars. Most European countries and the USA, in their history, they have one civil war. British Civil War, the American Civil War, Japan has had like 30 civil wars, right? Even though Japan's never been attacked from outside. Most civil wars come because you're attacked from outside. Most wars come because you're attacked from outside. Japan's never been attacked from outside hardly, and yet they're fighting all the time each other because the topography of Japan, the way the country fits together, it doesn't fit together, it falls apart. And that's, you can see mountain valley, how do you bind this all together, right? And so it so happened that when the Meiji emperor was put on the throne, other countries are also coming together in one block. So Germany and Italy, which had and still have very strong regional identities, came together under a kind of king, like Meiji actually, but who never really could hold things together. Right? So had Japan opened to the West 50 years before, one could easily have imagined Japan constructing itself as a federal country, not as a single nation state, so that Satsuma, I mean, maybe some of you have, I love Satsuma. It's really a different culture, right? They have different names from Japanese people. They drink different alcohol from people in Japan. Their food tastes different. And now they speak the same language, but before regional dialect would have been extremely strong. And Satsuma is an extreme case, but of course Tohoku and obviously where Kyoto and Osaka is different and Kanto is different. And so one thing which is intriguing about Japan, I think, is that the regional varieties which have come together and with this maintenance of historical traditions which were never destroyed by colonization. And I suppose that brings me to the one thing that probably did hold Japan together, which was the monarchy. And people don't like to talk about the emperor much here because very rapidly you start to talk about very right-wing things. And it's the same in Britain. People don't like to talk about the monarchy. If you talk about abolishing it, they suddenly say, no, we want to keep it. But if you start analyzing it, people want to talk about something else. So it's kind of there and it's better forgotten about. But it is, of course, what held Japan together. And most parts of the country that were trying to separate off, or most warlords that were trying to carve a little section of Japan to rule themselves, or even Satsuma or whatever, they always accepted this figure above, this person that today we call the Emperor Tenno. For much of history, he wasn't called Tenno, other names for him, but a kind of strange figure, right? And there's only been 2 moments in all of Japanese history when they tried to abolish the emperor, right? Replace him with somebody else. One, and both very, very ancient. One was Taira no Masakado, right? And the other was in the Nara period when Empress Koken tried to have a non-lineal successor. On both occasions, incidentally, it was Hachiman, the god Kami Hachiman, who they regard as a bodhisattva, who intervened and stopped the monarchy from being passed to another person. So I noticed I've only got 5 minutes. I can't believe I've spoken so much already. But I'd like to just come back from a really wonderful point that Melissa made, her thing about situations, about adaptability. And that I have a very similar view. I think exactly that's a very perceptive thing to have said. And one little anecdote which reminds me of that, and I've brought this back to myself many, many times, is that I went to a cafe that I often used to go to, and I always used to have a coffee, which is very nice. But one day I went and I'd already had a couple of coffees, so I better not have another coffee, so I asked for a cocoa. And they brought this drink to me, which was manifestly not cocoa. And so I didn't drink it. And then when it was time to go, they looked and said, "You haven't had what didn't you like your cocoa? What's wrong with it?" I said, "Well, it's probably a nice drink, it's not cocoa." And they said, "Kono mise de wa kono koko kore wa koko to mimasu." Right? It doesn't matter what you think cocoa is, this is what it is here. Right? And that way, and of course they're completely right. I mean, how could I can't define cocoa, right, in that situation. And so I like the way that here there's often, when there's any kind of a meeting, you begin with a setsumekai. You begin a moment at which you tell everyone where things are. And then you know where you stand. And if that's not the way you think, you leave that group and you go to another group. So kind of warakuyeba, you get these habatsu that don't talk to each other, but kind of yokuyeba, you can have a tea ceremony in which there's 15 different yuha. And the only difference is how you fold your napkin or something. But in this tea house, we fold it this way, right? And if you want to fold it that way, they do it over there, right? That's a rather trivial example, but could also relate to, how you do politics, how you run your company. This way, we do it here. And then I'm now down to my last minute, but because in history I study, I'm very interested in religions, and I know Melissa is from what she's been telling us as well. And I happen to live with a Japanese person who always says to me, you don't know how annoying it is to live with a monotheist. And that is actually, if you come from a monotheist, I'm not particularly Christian, but I can't deny, that's the way I think about things. And of course, in Japan, everything is always plural, right? It's a polytheistic system. Nothing is ever the one answer. In this case, this is the answer. If you want to get rain, this is your God. If you want to cure your toothache, that is your God. If you live in this part of the country, that's your God. And so there's plurality, whereas that's a very, very fundamental difference. So what Melissa referred to as reflexibility or situationalism or adaptability, I think that is a very key concept. And it also creates harmony, because you don't have to say, you think differently from me, who's right and who's wrong, and whoever's right takes over who's wrong, all right? And that doesn't, on the whole, happen here. Anyway, that's just my little opinions about things, so thank you for listening. Okay, so Toshikata suggested that we begin by first asking each other a question, and then I think it's over to you. So do you want to ask me something first, Melissa, or shall I ask you something first?
Yeah, I think I'm curious about this idea of monotheistic versus pluralistic. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and not necessarily being that religious even maybe, but how that shapes your worldview and a few more maybe examples of how that.
Right. I think, obviously I can't say we because Gaikoku is many different places and different things, but okay, so actually, let me give you another anecdote. Sorry, so many anecdotes. But I had a Japanese friend who came to London, and I asked him what was the biggest difference he felt living in London, or what he felt was special about Japan now that he'd seen foreign countries. And he said, harmony. And I immediately said, oh, that's not true, because, and then we both laughed. Because he'd said harmony and I'd contradicted. We'd both been total cliches. He was right. Right? And so, there's two arguments, and you have to find which is correct. And if things don't work out, you fight. But if things work out, somebody accepts they were wrong and they change their opinion. All right. But if there's a multiplicity, then it's like like coffee or tea, right? Do you like coffee or tea? You can't every day have an argument about it. So at the end, you go one way or the other, right? And then you say, well, I have tea for breakfast, but then we'll have coffee off for lunch because that's what you prefer. And you find a balance between. So that's a case where you can have pluralities, but they all have their place and they stay in their places. The polytheism of it is completely polytheistic, right? So it's not even either or, right? There's an infinity of possibilities. And because there's an infinity of possibilities, it means you can bring one extra in without it mattering. So I was at the Kenkyuko the other day, and somebody's talking about why Japanese adopted dress, so foreign Western dress so easily, compared with many cultures, like in Myanmar, people still wear their local clothes. In Arab countries, they almost always wear their local clothes still. Why did the Japanese adopt Western dress so easily? I think because already the Japanese had 6 or 8 different kind of clothing for different situations, right? You didn't wear the same clothing. Of course, your kaikyu, your mibun changed your clothing, and whether you were married or unmarried changed your clothing. Just adding on another one was not a problem, right? So that gives Japanese, I think, a great flexibility and makes the fact that, with all due respect, without having great language skills, Japanese people often don't speak foreign languages very well. They actually adapt very well to foreign countries because they can take on another way of behaving and it doesn't really matter to them very much. And Westerners, when they go to another country, they get really annoyed if they can't have the thing that they want, right? Why can't I have my, bagel and lox? Why can't I have my espresso in the afternoon?
Yeah.
Right? People come with their expectations and they get frustrated when they don't find them. Because in Japan, this is the way we do it here. So goniichi gonishidaga kind of way of thinking, I think.
I mean, I'm remembering back in the early days with my foreigner friends wanting to go to a cafe and always wanting real milk, gyunyu, not kripu, not the powdered kind, not cream or creamer, or but this was such an issue amongst us because we were very much on like keeping our standards of what the way it should be, instead of just adapting to the situation in which that was not a choice.
Yeah,
exactly. But there's actually one other thing. I don't know if this is related to what you said or not, but something that's still talking about meetings in Japan. One thing that's really, even today, still surprised me is that there's something about how within a group, there is the seeking of consensus. Okay, this is obviously something we all know about, that you seek a consensus in Japan. But I always assumed that at some point it would be majority rule. Like you have a group, and if you have most people think one thing, and then maybe one person or two people think another thing. I think in the United States, probably in Europe, like the majority would win. They would say, okay, we're gonna, we'll do what the majority says. But my experience, and this has been really surprising to me, even to this day in Japan, is that within a group, very often, if one person objects to the proposal, and everyone else likes it, still it will not pass. The one person, so in a certain way, like there's something about this idea of consensus that everybody's needs matter. The needs of every person in the group are valuable, and one dissenting opinion can ruin a committee. I'm on a lot of committees nowadays, and one person's objecting to what's being proposed can make the thing not pass. And this happens in my meetings at work, in committees I'm in. So the idea of consensus is truly something about consensus, in that that's also a very different kind of thinking in a group than what we would be used to.
That's a very interesting idea, because if the person objects, then they can stop the thing from passing.
Right.
But then they've got to think to themselves, everyone will be annoyed at me.
Yeah.
And if I repeatedly do this, I'll get the reputation as being a difficult figure.
Right.
So actually you could easily come around and without being overridden, you'd say, I withdraw my objection.
Yeah.
And I imagine, fortunately, I don't sit on many committees, but I imagine that happens too.
Yeah.
Right?
So, I mean, of course, those of you who are in the Japanese workplace, this issue, this idea of nemoashi, like back channeling, or, it's like, it's going to everybody individually in advance of any kind of a vote, because you want to try to, anybody who might potentially object, in the committee or something, you want to talk to them in advance. And I think it happens probably in politics, in any country in a way, but especially in Japan, because one person, it's like a filibuster almost. They can stop something from, a vote from going through, and that's kind of across the board, because nobody wants to make one person. So as you say, there's harmony. There's that eventually they probably want to come into harmony, but consideration for each member has to be taken. Otherwise, things won't happen.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So I'm sure there's people in the audience. So do you want to share the if there are questions?
So do you have any questions or comments to the Timon and Melissa?
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Just a quick Jikoshokai. My name is Connor. I've lived in Japan also for a number of years, and I run a study abroad center in Kyoto, so I also have many foreigners. New foreigners come to Japan every 6 weeks, hundreds of US study abroad students. You were given quite a difficult task tonight. It's quite broad, and as you said, you've been in Japan for a while. But Melissa, at Kyohaku, you have a number of non-Japanese visitors, and Tim, you also still teach and still talk to students and people who are here for the first time. If you had to choose one or two overriding conceptions, misconceptions from the people you come into contact with, non-Japanese, when they come here, what would they be? Maybe you can talk about art and things like that, and Melissa, you can talk about the people who come to the museum. That might be interesting to discuss.
Misconception. I could probably speak more from the other direction. Maybe I'll let you
Okay,
speak
well,
first if you're able.
Well, I mean, one, I suppose, is that people think Japanese are, they don't see the flip side. So that people know Japanese are diligent and hardworking and have a lot of rules about things. School uniforms are very strict, and when you go to a company, you have to dress in a certain way. But people often don't know that there's the whole other side of Japanese culture, which is the humor, the wit, the kind of cheekiness of people as well. And I think when, I'm sure we've all know that, but a lot of people I think come and are very surprised to find Japan is not like, it's not like boring. People I think the cultures, the kind of Kodai stuff is amazing, and they're surprised to discover that. The other another thing is the whole Zen thing, right? Since I'm a historian and I'm interested in history of religion, I get annoyed really the way that Zen has taken over the discourse of what Japanese history is. I often say, I don't know this is a fact, but I often say it anyway, that the proportion of Japanese who are Zen is much lower than the proportion of Americans who are Seventh-day Adventists. Right? I mean, they just aren't Zen people in Japan. There are some people today who do Zazen as an interest, and that's, of course, I'm not saying it's not valid, but the idea that somehow or other Japan is defined by Zen is completely bogus. But it just so happens that Kyoto wasn't bombed, and the second shogunate that was based in the Ashikaga shogunate was based in Kyoto, and it was Zen, so it patronized a lot of Zen temples, and they happened to survive. Right? All the many temples in Tokyo, now they're gone, right? So people come here and all they see is Zen temples. They think that's my second. You asked for 3 errors. I wonder what the third. But anyway, that's 2. I hope 2 is enough to start with. When Melissa's speaking, I'll think of the third.
I'm going to actually, no, I don't know if I can think of the third, but the Zen issue for me too is especially having like lived in, had personal experience, and then today, having continued connections with Zen temples, and the idea that that Zen definitely. I mean, of course, Zen Buddhism. I mean, there are elements of Zen Buddhism that and the training and the sort of practices of training for Zen. All of that, waking up early, being 15 minutes early for everything, keeping everything clean, not saying anything. I mean, being silent, but doing everything very efficiently. That whole idea of being, again, adaptable, being able to do anything well. A good Zen monk is like good cook, a really good cook, good at cleaning, good at, taking leadership if need be, or good at being the best servant and helper if need be, like can do anything. And I think from a Western perspective, I guess a lot of people perceive Zen as very much entirely about mindfulness and, breathing and maybe not even breathing, but like focus and mindfulness about what you're doing. And of course that is part of it, but I would say that more than that, like Zen, the relationship of Zen and Japanese culture is again, as Tim says, Zen is only one of many Buddhist sects, and Zen in particular has an emphasis on cleaning and practice in terms of lifestyle, daily lifestyle. But it's not necessarily it's not the only Buddhist sect, and it's not necessarily the most overriding one. So the other thing is like Zen, the idea of Zen paintings. There's a lot of ideas of Zen paintings being, every Zen painting having some kind of an anecdote or koan or something behind it, and that's not necessarily the case. That the things that we think of as Zen paintings in general are the monochrome ink paintings that decorate Zen temples, that kind of thing. But I'm not sure that that's quite answering the question.
I mean, in a way, you can see why people are so interested in Zen today, because much of Buddhism was about ritual spells, right? Tendai and Shingon. You conduct spells for childbirth, for long life, particularly for the safety of the state, for the health of your lord. And today, who wants to do that? I mean, nobody believes in it. So the rituals can still happen, but they don't evoke thrill in modern day people. Whereas Zen, concentrating yourself or do a beautiful garden or paint, these are still things that we find meaningful. So Zen is kind
Maybe
of charging on,
relevant.
right?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But Zen had a whole other side to it, because also a lot of it's to do with protection of the state. These Tofukuji, these great temples, they became rich because they were merchant bases, right? All the ships trading with China were run by Zen monks. Right, so we've selected, and of course, also the other thing is that Tendai and Shingon, they all did Zen as well. It wasn't like Zen only happened in Zen temples. So, Zen's kind of gone its own sweet way, and it's begun to mean something different, which is an interesting thing. But what I just don't like is if people think this is how you define Japanese culture, especially not throughout history.
Okay. We have a question from online. Question to Timon. Thank you for your interesting talk. Timon's research focuses on Edo Shogun and Shunga. Do you have insights on Japanese cultural uniqueness from that perspective?
Well, shoguns and shunga are quite different things. But let's start with shoguns. Obviously we say in English we use the word shogun because there's no way of describing such a role in European political language, because no European political system had such a person. Of course, neither did any other Chinese, Asian political system. The Chinese never called him the shogun, right? The Koreans almost virtually, I think, until modern times, the Koreans always called the shogun the kampaku, even though he wasn't the kampaku. Because they needed a way in the Korean language to describe this person. Anyway, the Europeans until Meiji always called the shogun the emperor. But today we don't, that's not right, so we just say shogun. So he's this figure. And then there's the other one, right? The emperor. And of course today we say emperor, but the reason we call him the emperor is because the Europeans used to call the shogun the emperor. And when Meiji comes to the throne, they will not accept Westerners calling the emperor the king, because it sounds like he's worse than the shogun he's replaced. So they insist on maintenance of the term emperor, and because the Europeans already talk about the emperor of China, they think, okay, emperor of Japan, fair enough, right? But he's the only emperor who's never had an empire, right? So it's a very strange title. And the Europeans used to call mostly they call the emperor of Japan the Pope, right, until modern times. So anyway, Japan has this dual system of rule. And maybe that goes back again to this polytheistic thing. There's a toleration of two systems of rule. People often say to me, students say, why didn't the shogun kill the emperor and become emperor? They say, well, why don't you kill the pope and become pope? It doesn't work that way, right? So anyway, this very anomalous dual system of governments, which you don't find in Korea or China, of course you don't find in European systems, unless you think of the emperor as being a pope, in which case you can somewhat
deified,
map it off. Yeah. So anyway, that's a kind of rambling response. But the dual system of emperor and pope, emperor and shogun is a very interesting thing. But the emperors always exist, right? The emperor, the handing on of rule to the emperor, of course it's myth, but the handing on to rule of emperor from the gods is when time begins. Until then, there was no time. And there can be no time if the emperor goes, right? So the emperor is coterminous with the existence of human life in this world. He, being a divinity, he can't disappear, right? Whereas shoguns are in time. It's always surprised me when the Meiji powerful Americans come, the Tokugawa Bakufu, they just give up, say, okay, we finished now. Their tiny little civil war didn't amount to much, right? So shoguns are in time. They're time specific, they're time delimited. Anyway, that's a kind of meditation, if it's worth that term, on those two roles. As for shunga, so shunga survives in Japan in extremely large numbers. We're talking about Edo period erotic paintings and prints, right? Survives in Japan in very large numbers. And it doesn't hardly exist in Europe, nor does it exist in China or Korea or the Middle East, much. So the question is, was it never made in Europe, or was it made, doesn't survive? What usually is the expectation in the West is that pornography, as we call it, is made and consumed by men. Women do not approve of it, right? They don't consume it, they don't need it for their sexual interests. Men do. And women live longer than men. So the husband will always die, and the wife will find the porn collection, and she's horrified and she burns it. So it doesn't survive in Europe. The widow in Japan always knew the husband had it, and in fact she probably viewed it with him. And so when she finds it, it's fine, let's save it, it's nice stuff, we'll hand it to our daughter later on, right, when she gets married. So shunga has a very different purpose, and in other words, female consumption. And why women wanted it is a hugely difficult question to do with female emancipation, sexual awareness in young girls and things. But because shunga was made on the expectation that women might well view it, it shows female. And shunga is very nearly completely without violence against women. Whereas Western pornography is filled with violence against women. Let's hope men don't actually do it, but they fantasize about it, possession. And so much of the metaphors of love, and it's about assault. The woman is a castle you're trying to assault like a soldier, right? Battling down. These metaphors in Western erotic writing so much, you just don't really see them in Japan. I could speak for an hour about that, but I better stop. But when you look at shunga, you should probably think to yourselves, it's not showing you what sex was like in the Edo period. It's showing you what Edo people fantasize sex could be like, which probably is the opposite of what sex actually was. Because if you want sex what it was, you do it. If you have a fantasy that can't be provided for by what's available, you make pictures of it. And hopefully that's why pictures of rape prevent rapes from happening, let's hope, right? And pictures of women having wonderful time in sexual intercourse may be actually because women might not be having such a wonderful time, but in any case, it was part of the fantasy of men. Part of the fantasy of men was that women that they were doing it with also enjoyed it. And much of the fantasy of Western men, sadly, is that they've got something that wasn't easily available. Right?
Are there any questions from audience?
There's a lady there.
Hello everyone. I'm from Taiwan, and I'm a painter. I almost lived in Kyoto for 9 years.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, and the lady mentioned that the person working in museum, they change their words 3 years.
Yeah.
I think maybe not only for to training their adaptation, but also to avoid power abuse.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I just want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I didn't say that, but it also is, as you say, it's also to avoid conflicts of interest, like ingrained kind of too many deep contacts with vendors, and so that you'd have issues with when you have money involved, of course.
And I also noticed that Japanese, they are so concerned about the opinion of foreigners because there is a school in the South Kyoto in Katsura named International Japan Cultural Center.
Is that the research center for Japanese studies?
Yeah.
That's where I am. Yes.
And I was a student.
Oh, really? All right.
1 year.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I noticed this. This is very interesting
Yes.
because they built a school in 1983,
Yes.
which is 40 years ago.
Yes.
And just for want to know the foreigner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also I am from Taiwan, so in Taiwan we don't have such institutions.
Right.
Yeah,
Interesting.
And something about this, I found that Japanese, they are so concerning about the opinion of foreigners, but they are expecting of the plus, of the
Praise.
Yeah. Of the praise.
Yes,
Yeah,
interesting.
they are expecting that.
Right.
To be
To be praised. Interesting.
I found that.
Yes.
The same case in Taiwan. Taiwanese are also very concerned about the opinion of foreigners, but we are more expecting of the minus.
Really?
We want to know where we can still improve.
Ah, I see. Yes.
And if we be praised, we will feel
Yeah.
we are not so good.
That's interesting.
That's very interesting.
Right.
Yeah, and also in Taiwanese, we are not colonized
Yes.
by the West
Yes,
for a
indeed.
long time.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you went to Taiwan, go to Taiwan, then you can also speak English and you can understand everything.
Yes.
Yeah, so I found it very interesting, the differences between Taiwan and Japan.
Yes.
And also, as a Taiwanese living here for almost 10 years, I found that, yes, Japan is very flexible, but at the same time, there isn't a correct answer, but there are many wrong answers.
That's great. Yeah.
This is also very interesting.
That's very interesting observations. Thank you very much. They're very interesting points.
Yeah,
Yes.
very astute. Yeah, interesting.
So working in that location, what is the purpose of the Japanese understanding the foreign perspective?
Oh,
What do they hope to
so this place called, I'm interested you were there. It's the Kokusai Nihon Bunka Kenkyu Center, International Research Center for Japanese Studies. Well, when it was set up, maybe what it's become is what you experienced, but when it was set up, it was actually intended to tell foreigners about Japan. So it was bubble times, right, in the 1980s. Japan had loads of money. Lots of people were coming to Japan, and lots of people saying Japan is this, Japan is that. And the Japanese government felt that a lot of incorrect opinions were going around. And so the idea was to tell the world what Japan should be. And it was quite a right-wing institution at the beginning, quite nationalistic. But over the time, it shifted. And the way that we tend to work now is not so much to hear what foreigners think about us, or us, them, which is although several people in Ichibunken are foreigners like me, so obviously we talk about these things. But so much Japanese history is written about being exclusive and unique, and our role today in the 21st century is to look at Japanese culture in international connections. So not just Meiji and Christian, Momoyama, but all the various ways in which there have been interconnections with the past over the course of history. That's what we're doing. Yeah.